welcome to our visual diplomacy workshop, and it's wonderful to see so many people. And had I known before, we would have gotten a slightly bigger room, but I didn't want to sort of turn people away and say, "No, sorry, you can't come." But the idea is to have that fairly small, intimate sort of workshop, and I hope once we get to know each other a bit better, this will become a nice, intimate setting, despite the fact that we're quite a few people. But before I say anything, I'd like to hand over to Professor Richard Levertuck, our head of school, who will say a few words of welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Roland. Yeah, well, thank you and welcome everyone. I won't take up too much of your time, but I'd like to begin firstly, even though this is quite a small gathering, just to acknowledge the land on which we gather and meet today, to acknowledge elders, past, present and future. It's a great delight and pleasure to welcome you all here, many familiar faces who've spent time here and have gone elsewhere, but it's good to see you back, and certainly nice to welcome our other colleagues and students to today's events. But I have particular pleasure really in welcoming an old friend, Iver Neumann, who I've known for many years. Iver occupies what has to be one of the world's most significant and eminent chairs in the discipline of international relations, the Montague Burton chair at the LSE. It's been held by a number of very esteemed professors, and I think it's very fitting that Iver occupies this chair. Perhaps by contrast with many of his predecessors, I think Iver ranges across an extraordinary range of topics and areas of research. He's done a lot of work around Russia, he's done work on histories and theories of international society, on diplomacy, and now, of course, visual politics and bringing that together with diplomacy. So it's terrific to see you back here again, Iver. You mentioned it's been 6 years since you were last here. That seems like a very long time ago, but it's terrific to have you here, and terrific to have so many of you in the audience. Thank you, Roland, for organising what's sure to be a terrific event. I really wish I could stay, but I have meetings planned for the rest of the day, so I won't be able to stay, but I'm sure it's going to be a wonderful event. So thank you all for coming today. Thanks to Roland and others involved in the organisation of the event, and thank you and welcome again to Iver.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you, Richard, and a few words of welcome from me. First of all, also on behalf of Shreya Singh, we have co-organized the workshop together, and she has done a fantastic job together with Paul Crawford as well to get this all to where we are today. Now, Richard has already said everything about Iver, and you know, one of the remarkable things about Iver, I think, is that he is not just extremely prolific and extremely influential in international relations, but sort of the depth of work has done is very unusual. Now, most academics, they find one thing and they hammer away for the next 40 years, and they become known as the person who works in alliances or the person who works on realist foreign policy. But Iver has done work, path-breaking work on so many different areas, you know, on Russia, on diplomacy particularly, on method, on autoethnography, on theory, on history, on popular culture. It's absolutely remarkable. You know, to me, that's sort of the true hallmark of a scholar, is someone who keeps exploring, doesn't stand still, explores new ideas. Visual politics is perhaps one of the most recent explorations that Iver has pursued, and to me, that's sort of, you know, that's what I aspire to be one day when I'm grown up. So I hope I can live up to that. A few words about the organization. So we're pretty flexible. You know, we have the room until 10 to 4, and we can sort of run it informally. The idea is in the first session in the morning, Iver will present, or not really present, since we have all read his paper. He will just talk a little bit about the context of his paper on visual diplomacy, and then hopefully we can get feedback from you, discussion, interaction. We have a catered lunch, which will be downstairs in the courtyard for us to get a bit of fresh air in the middle, even though it's the middle of a very harsh winter, as Iver has experienced coming from Norway, where it's much warmer. And at the afternoon, it's all meant to be basically to provide feedback to you, and hopefully in as constructive, relaxing, supportive manner as possible. If we finish a bit early in the morning, we might squeeze in 1 or 2 papers already before lunch. But the idea is, again, as I've mentioned in an email, for you to present very, very crisp way you project, not so much summarizing the project or summarizing the argument, but more telling us in 2 or 3 minutes what you're working on, and mostly what is the key thing you're struggling with, what do you want to get feedback on, so that we can sit together here, brainstorm. We got you got 25 minds thinking, even just for 10 minutes, that's 2 hours of high-powered brain energy to get your project rolling and address some of the issues that you have. That's in short the idea for today, and I think before we sort of start off, it might be nice if we have quick introductions that we know a little bit of who the people are, what your background is, and why you're interested in visual politics. So I might start with myself. Sort of had a long interest in questions of aesthetics and questions of visual stuff, which I sort of done in combination, and I'm coordinating a program here on visual politics that brings together a range of people from different disciplines, from anthropology to political science, from media studies to art history to computer science, sort of to look at the role of images in a variety of contexts. So this is, for me, wonderful to have so many people here, and particularly having Iver present to talk about these issues. Maybe we'll, you want to go around very quickly from around the table?
Hey, my name's Alistair. I'm actually a pre-grad student in my second year of doing politics, so I'm doing peace and conflict, and I've been getting more into international relations. Been particularly interested in media and visuals in the politics, so getting into the visual elements of it. Got my interest in this course, so thought I'd come along today.
I'm Amy. I'm a sneaky undergrad too, and I'm studying peace and conflict and social psychology, and I'm thinking of going into a dual degree with communications. So it's a new field of interest that I'm just discovering, and I thought I'd learn as much as I can to see if it's worth studying later on, researching.
My name's Shreya. My undergrad was in IR and French. Started my postgrad on Monday. I'm doing a Master of International Relations, International Law, and I'm really interested in foreign policy, gender and peace.
I'm David Durasmith. I just started up as a postdoc here. I do work on masculinities and conflict, and have a paper brewing on sort of the visual masculine politics of jihadis based on some field work, so I was keen to hear people's thoughts today.
I'm Jennifer. I'm from the School of Social Science. My background was in IR at Griffith, and I've somehow found myself doing a PhD in anthropology, so being here feels like I'm coming home a bit. My research is on cultural identity performance in Tibetan diasporic communities, so there is a very heavily political element to that, so I'm hoping to get some good feedback from people today. That's some of my ideas.
I'm Christian. I'm a film historian, and I just thought it would be nice to get something that's more like legit backing for things of the political and diplomacy on a new project I'm working on.
Hi everyone, I'm Faiza. I come from an industry background in policy, and I'm doing my PhD here at the University of Queensland, and it's in gender, but I'm interested in all things visual and in diplomacy.
Hi, I'm June. I'm a PhD student here as well at the School of Analysis. I'm currently based in Singapore. My research is on macro securitization.
I was waiting. Hello everybody, I'm Stan from the Philippines. I'm a PhD student here in policies. I'm doing something on theory, exploring the idea of global theory, asking the question, what does it mean to do theory in a global context? Looking at the concept of international order from the Western to China, Islam, as a way to flesh out, conceptualize what that global theory might be or might look like.
I'm Samid Suleiman. I'm a lecturer in migration and security at Griffith University in the School of Humanities, Languages and Social Science, and a graduate of the PhD program here, so it is possible. I work on migration, mobility, critical international relations and security studies. I come to the visual by thinking about the constitutive role of movement in politics and thinking about modes and means of representation of migration.
Would you like to go ahead?
I'll stand up because I'm hiding back here. My name's Alex Stenlake. I've just commenced honours here at UQ. My current work has been kind of revolving around neural networks for solutions of missing data in political and social sciences, but I kind of want to come to this workshop to kind of break out the quantitative sort of data-driven mold and see what new ideas and concepts are out there. It's more an exploration than anything else.
I'm Stephanie Fischel. I'm an assistant professor at University of Alabama. I've been here for 6 weeks on a fellowship with Smite at Griffith. I work, what do? I guess the way I come to the visual is through, my last work was on metaphors and thinking about how we think. And so now I'm trying to puzzle through how we might see and think differently about the world around us, especially through those dichotomies of nature and culture that we're so familiar with.
I'm Elmarie. I'm actually a PhD student in history. Towards the end of it, hopefully. I look at domestic service in Britain and Australia from 1914 to 45, but my disciplinary home is IR, and I worked in the South African Department of Foreign Affairs for a couple of years before I started here. But yeah, this is definitely coming used to work at the school as well.
Hi, I'm Federica. I'm a PhD student in the School of Politics and International Studies, and I work on the body and militarism and militarization, but also on gender and sexuality and visual politics.
Hi, I'm Paul. I'm a PhD student here at UQ, and I'm looking at the securitization migration, how identity ontological security works in that area in Australia and in Turkey.
Hi, I'm Megan. I'm a PhD in the department. My thesis is on justification and the use of force, and I guess I'm here to broaden my understanding of representation and communication, because that's pertinent to my thesis, I think. Yeah, that's good.
Hi everyone, I'm Connie. I'm a postdoc research fellow in Pulses. My PhD research looked at representation and recognition, and I explored that through Iran-US relations, and now I'm moving into examining that dynamic via social media. So some of my current work is on Twitter, and so this is why I'm interested in the visual aspect of how social media can create an effective dimension that might influence foreign policy decisions. So I'm excited about today.
Hi everyone, I'm Helen. I'm a lecturer in policy and governance at QUT, but I'm also a graduate of Pulses. My work is primarily interested in young people's engagement in peace and conflict. I've done field work in Latin America on that. More recently I've been looking at representations of young people and how young people appear when we talk about conflict and crisis, and particularly in relation to the high volume of circulation of images of dead children is my current work. So that's where I come into the visual.
Hi, I'm Shreya. I've been coordinating the workshop with Roland, so it's really nice to see everybody. I've been emailing you all back and forth. Nice to put a face to the name. I'm doing my MPhil here, and I'll be talking more about my work at the presentation, but it's broadly on India and North Korea's nuclear images. So, it's exciting work. Thank you.
I'm Catherine. I've just submitted my MPhil thesis. I was looking at how 2 Australian artists represent militarised technology in their paintings. Really interested in how art history can intersect with other disciplines, because my thesis was interdisciplinary, technical, all kinds of different modalities brought into it. So that's why I'm here today.
I'm Stephen. Like Catherine, I'm from SCA, School of Communication and the Arts, but having heard what you've said, I think I should have been here instead. I did it, my background's kind of film studies, media studies, cultural history, but I did a PhD on Australian newspapers' representations of the Bali bombing of 2002, which includes questions of visual material, not just the photographs used, but also layout and so on and so on. And it ended up being an analysis of the ways in which those 3 newspapers, in various ways, construct the foreign. The real foreign, of course, the terrorists. The other foreign, who kind of get benignly kind of overlooked by the Balinese? Thank you.
Well, we've got an amazing range of expertise, not just disciplinary diversity, but in terms of interests. So we should be having very interesting and very stimulating day together. Now, before I pass on to Iver, just one big disclaimer. I'm extremely rude in having my phone on here because I'm sort of on standby for a possible emergency call. So if I get a phone call, it's not out of disrespect. I'll be dashing out and dealing with it. But on that note, I mean, I'll hand over to Iver. Let's go as long or short as you like, and then we'll open it up and we'll see how we go from here.
Excellent. Thank you, and thanks for inviting me.
Thanks so much for traveling half across the world to be with us.
Yes, and I won't say that I'm radiant that your wife isn't here, because I've been looking forward to seeing her. But as a fellow kidney transplantee, I must say that I am absolutely thrilled that she's not here. So please do keep that telephone on, and do send her all best wishes. I just wanted to situate the paper. You somewhat did it for me by saying that my Tourette's has taken me to new corners of the field, and I bore easily. So once I understand something, I need to go on because there is nothing there for me, and that means that I come to new places all the time. And unfortunately, it hasn't been like Hirschman's career. You remember Hirschman of Exit, Voice and Loyalty, Fame, and The Interests and the Passions, and those books. He was like that, but you know, when he was done, he had done a book that then stood as the book in the field for the next 50 years. Then he moved on. You know, I hadn't done it like that. I've just written an article and said, here it is, and I'm looking at something new, and here it is, and with one exception, the reaction of the discipline has been, oh, so this is new, yeah. There is a reason why we haven't looked at it before. Bugger off. And then after a couple of years, there has been some interest, and then that interest has grown, which has been nice. My coming to the visual has been different, Roland, because you beat me to it by about 20 years. And the reason I was roped into it was that Lena Hansen of Copenhagen University, who's an old friend, called me up and said, I have some money, do you want it? And you know, when people put food or money in front of me, I never say no. I mean, that's very important. That's an important principle of my life. So I said, sure, what do you want me to do? And she said, you can do anything you want on the visual, because the project is about constituting new data for IR. That new data should be visual. It could be cartoons, it could be photographs, it could be paintings, anything, as long as it's visual. So I embarked on two small projects. The goal of the projects is to produce an article, right? And one of them is on monuments, where I've done some reading in archaeology over the last 4 years, and it's an example. It's an attempt to ask of monuments, where is the other, right? Because monuments are they are consciously freezing the self in time, right? They're trying to stop time by having this chunk of stone, which is the long-lasting natural material, right? A chunk of stone, or something, some other long-lasting thing, metal, sometimes glass. Not talking installations, we're talking slabs here, right? And excellent work says, you know, let's look at how the self presents itself and how it wants to be, and the difference between the fantasy and the reality, and la-di-da. And I said, well, let's not. Let's look at the other. And then I found the other in 3 different places. You know, the other can be under the hooves of the horse, as it were. You know, in a number of European monuments, you will have the other as the vanquished soldier that is literally being tread on by these horse hooves, right, or falling off the plinth of the monument. I mean, they're, as they say in the city where I work, they're royally fucked, basically. So that would be the dominated other, as it were. Then you would have a tradition of the other as death, which emanates from the Eurasian steppes, where there was this tradition of taking the heads of dead animals, cutting them off, and making pyramids. Very nice. And it was a practical matter because you were rewarded by your boss on the basis of how many heads you'd cut off. But it's a wonderful way of presenting the other in a monument. I mean, literally sort of bringing things to a head, as it were. And we still find it. As we speak, there are remnants of dead terrorists in British Museum, you know, and parts of their body armor, well, not body armor, the opposite, what do you call it? The suicide vest is the word I'm looking for, or the concept I'm looking for. So there you have the other as death. My favorite example of that would be Saddam Hussein's monument, the monument he built to the Iran-Iraq war in the center of Baghdad, where he puts the helmets of vanquished enemies around the monument so that trucks and cars will constantly drive over them. So these people are killed on a regular basis. It's not enough to kill them once. They're basically desecrated for the rest of their afterlife. And I also like the little detail that it's not the head as such, it's the helmet that stands in for the head. And you have a number of sort of ways of doing this. For example, taking the cannons of vanquished enemies and melt them down and build monuments out of that, etc. And then you have the third one, which is increasingly, I think, important, which is the other is absent. There is no other. Typical example would be the Vietnam Memorial in the US, where they list every single name of every single American who died, which I think is an absolutely terrible thing to do. What about the people they killed? They're not there. So by celebrating the dead selves, I think you are basically giving the finger to the dead others. But that's not the piece that I will present today that you've read. This piece is simply about sort of trying to kill two birds with one stone, trying to bring diplomacy to the visual and the visual to diplomacy. So I'm simply taking the visual turn, the stuff that people like Richard, and also then Roland, and also Richard, by the way. Richard has a piece on the Gothic in Review International Studies, which I still think is quite inspiring because the Gothic isn't over. The Gothic is still all around us. And bring all that to the study of diplomacy. And when I was here last in 2011, it was actually to put the finishing touches to a book on diplomacy, Psychic Diplomacy, where I took all the spin-off essays I'd done on diplomacy over the last 15 years and put them together as a book. And this was a wonderful place to do that, and I acknowledged that in the preface. So I should have stayed for a month this time as well, you know, and tried to put something together. But instead I'll simply present this article where I basically look at what diplomats do, don't I? What do they do that isn't textual? How do they put themselves on show? How do they try to awe the different audiences? And well, you've seen the results. I think they're meager but important, which is more than I usually get to say. But the basic argument, I think, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say about this. The basic argument, I think, is simply that since a diplomatic spiel is always a multi-audience affair, it is fraught with danger because you have to speak to a number of different audiences. And I mean, we had two people who are doing social media, and you know, this stuff is just proliferating. I mean, the number of audiences involved is just going through the roof, and the number of media involved would be one thing, but the other thing is how many more people are actually have the material resources to follow this stuff. as the Danes found out to their surprise and dismay over the Muhammad Cartoons crisis. They were sitting producing stuff and had no idea that there were audiences out there that suddenly made Danish diplomacy a very interesting spectacle, I would say, actually. So that's the one thing, the sort of the multiple audience thing. The other thing is, of course, even more obvious, that when you try to impress another party, this, I think, is such, to me, this is such an obvious point, but to a number of people working in IR, I don't think people in this room, because what I heard is that we're all working in global politics, which is not really IR in that sense. It's lots of transnational stuff and not so much state to state. But you know, diplomacy has traditionally been studied as very much of a state to state thing. Right? So once you start looking at it transnationally, subnationally, hypernationally, things are becoming more messy. But the obvious point here is that if you try to awe the other party, and you always try to awe the other party, that's what a diplomat does. You want to keep the other party off balance. You want to make the other party do something that that other party wouldn't otherwise have done, which is the basic definition of power. Right? And one way of doing that is to either scare them in terms of sublimity, in the sense of sort of knocking them out by doing something that is just so goddamn cool or so damn goddamn scary that they have no choice but to do what you want them to do, right? And sometimes that actually works. A favorite example would be Richard Holberg taking the parties to the Balkan crisis in the 1990s into a room, running some simulations of what American air power could do, and say, okay, boys, you want to think about it? And they did. Now that's visual diplomacy for you. That is standard sublimity. There are other ways. You can charm the pants of somebody. Right? We have examples of that in diplomatic history as well. Maybe, Federica, we should pair up and do sexuality and diplomacy in that sense, because we have a number of examples of those kinds of practices. And one of the things you do then, of course, is that you use what is at your disposal in order to seduce. And the basic example of this, I've written articles on this, and of course in Millennium, which is the place that basically publishes what we're doing on this, on Byzantine diplomacy, where the idea was to impress the other party by stimulating all their senses. Good food, lots of fragrances, roaring lions. You know, the Byzantines would sit here, then they would have lions hydraulically driven on either side, and suddenly these lions would come up. And the other parties would often be from low tech cultures and would just go, whoo! And what was that? They would have little flying mechanical birds, you know. And we're talking the first sort of millennium of our era, and we're talking the beginning centuries of the second millennium. I mean, this was not your everyday stuff, right? So they were basically awing the other party and saying, wow, you know, and then they made the deals. We will have trading rights and da 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 da. And we have a couple of examples of this, people coming to Byzantium and being overwhelmed. So this is what I'm trying to do in the paper. By way of saying thank you for the introductions, though, this important chair that I'm having and all the important stuff that I've published, I will not omit to mention, as a diplomat would say, that this paper has already been rejected by 2 journals in IR. It was desk rejected by Review International Studies, which said that they couldn't see how this paper furthered the visual turn in any way, which is in some sense true. There is nothing original here in terms of scopic regimes for the visual, except that I'm applying it to a new empirical field, right? The other journal was International Political Sociology, which had a number of good reasons why they wouldn't publish it, which basically boiled down to this not being a cutting-edge visual turn paper as well. And I think this is quite important, because this has been my experience with publishing in IR for 30 years. It's not easy. You know, have you ever seen a sort of Monty Python sketch called The Fish Dance? I mean, that's what it feels like trying to publish, right? You stand there and suddenly this fish comes across your face. Right? So I've had both my chins sort of hit my fish now, but with your help, I'm going to make this publishable, and I'm going to have it out there. And I'm sure that there will be a reception in due course. So, but keep this in mind. I think, you know, the senior people in the field should always do this. We should share our rejection letters with the younger colleagues and students, so that you're not scared shitless of what's lying ahead. Because why should you be the one person in the world who's not rejected? I mean, that's being rejected is part of life, basically, and it's definitely part of life. So, should we go into that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But maybe just a quick remark to precisely reinforce what Iver has said, isn't it? That when you do a PhD or an early career researcher, getting a rejection is an absolutely devastating kind of blow, and some people have a hard time recovering from it. And they keep saying, look, I have a pile about this big of rejection letters, I'll give that to my students to read. And that's just part of academic life, and you have to develop a thick skin. And you know, it's sometimes a paper isn't good. Sometimes it's not about quality. Sometimes it's about disciplinary politics. It's about, you know, egos of referees who think, you know, I haven't been cited, therefore I'm going to smash this paper. There's lots of reasons, and the only way to persist, to survive, is just to persist and, you know, rewrite, resubmit it. I had a paper sometimes I had 5-6 rejections before I managed to publish it, and I think hearing that from one of the most senior and prolific scholars in the field is very reassuring, I think, that, you know, we all into this, and that's just part, unfortunately, of academic culture. That's you know, inevitable.
And don't keep it inside, because then you'll explode.
Yeah. Exactly.
I always these letters. I mean, do you remember the house ghosts in Gryffindor? What's his name? Nearly Headless Snake. That's the one. It says, oh no, I don't really care that I'm not can't join the headless hunt. You know, it hasn't been. And then it turns out it's been an ambition for 500 years, right? And you know, that's my first reaction when I get a rejection. Who do they think they are anyway? And then sort of about 5 minutes later, he said, what the? And I'm sort of calling my wife. And he says, well, let's have a look at it. I said, well, it's not all bad. They say here that this is rather good. All right, yeah, well, maybe I can do something about it. You know. And this is just how it works, right? And I'm now 57 years old. When I was a student, I thought I would sort of get to be more mature about these things. Talk about growing up. You know. But I can tell you it works the other way around. The more you publish, the more reasons you think it is why they should show a bit of deference. And they don't. And you know, even as a Scandinavian, I think that's pretty galling.
I could confess I've been rejected from both of those journals as well. For me it was on Moralization as well. I was writing on Enola Gay and Hiroshima, and when I sent it to RIS, they're like, yeah, we don't like your case studies. I was like, well, that's the whole article. They're like, you could totally redo it, and then we might look at it again. And I was like, yeah, that's good. And then the IPS was, I wrote, it was early and it was probably terrible, but it was all on Latour and sociology and looking at that, and I sent it to IPS, and the main person who rejected it said I didn't talk about sociology at all. It was that moment of like, all right.
But there are also light moments. For example, I had a rejection where the basic argument was that I hadn't looked at Ivan Newman's work. So these things happen. Jason Sharman, who used to work down the road, who is now in Cambridge, just told me that he had 2 articles that were accepted by I.O. And as it happens, that's submission 25 and 26. So, hang on in there.
Yeah, hang on. And if you ever do reviewing yourself, I think keep that in mind if you do a 3 or 4. You know, be critical, but also be generous, and you know, think that there's a person behind that, and you Some of my reports said this piece looks like it's been written in one afternoon, and I spent like 3 months of full-time work on it. So if you end up reviewing, that's something to keep in mind. But look, we can talk about that as well later in the day, but I think for now, let's maybe focus on Iver's paper and give him some feedback, and try in the spirit of you get feedback in the afternoon, of helping each other to improve, fine-tune the piece. So you've all read it, we got plenty of time for discussion and feedback. Who would like to make a start?
I will.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed the paper, and it resonated with me from just the personal experience, actually. But the idea of show and tell, I've read in terms of art exhibitions, for instance, or performances that are sent overseas. There's a kind of reception from the, particularly in non-Western countries, that there's a show and tell aspect to it. Like the Western country comes in and does their little show and tell and thinks they've done this wonderful service by providing this attraction to the other. But the other often does see it just as simply as like a kindergarten show and tell, because often there's no continuity. There's nothing. It's not followed through with other happenings or events or discussion around the event. But the people putting it on go to the opening night or whatever, and they're in their fine gear. So this is where all the sartorial stuff comes in, and there are ribbons cut and there are flowers given. But the symbolic gestures don't seem to resonate. One is making a kind of gesture, but the other isn't necessarily receiving it in the way that the initial gesture is made. Well, I don't know if it could be helpful, but that whole idea of show and tell is a little juvenile, and maybe it's got something to do with this sort of spectacle.
I'll take that on. Would there be any specific place in the paper where you think that should be brought out more?
Well, you didn't really talk about performances or exhibitions or things like that, but in a sense, it still was this kind of sense. For instance, with the Caroline Kennedy, again a show and tell, and I often wonder whether when the other receives it, they know that there's a show and tell, so they play the game, but they see it as something a little as a performative thing that really doesn't resonate with deep symbolic meaning. You know, in the case of Caroline Kennedy, there was that celebrity status, which immediately puts it into a kind of more superficial category, and in that respect. And when you say that there was the spiteful component with the Eastern Europeans dressing down and so forth, I was interested in why you used the word spiteful.
Oh, it's much easier to answer specific critique than general critique. Anyone studying diplomacy has a hard time with Israel, because their idea of diplomacy is to tell everybody to bugger off before everybody else does anything. So the idea is they will be nasty and dangerous anyway, so we might as well insult them first, which is exactly the counter idea of what everybody else thinks diplomacy is about. And you know, the first thing you learn when you go to the diplomatic academy is don't antagonize your opponent unnecessarily. It's a good rule in life in general, I think. So you should certainly antagonize other people, but you shouldn't do it unnecessarily. There should be a reason why you do it. And I think spite is the word for when you do that without there really being a reason. There may be a reason in the sense that you will need to blow up some steam, but you won't get anywhere with it. It won't it might consolidate your own identity, but it won't get you anywhere in terms of what diplomacy is supposed to be about, which is establishing a rapport and get some kind of result, be that symbolically or outcome oriented, from the transaction. And this whole idea, what is at the bottom of this is Nietzsche's idea of ressentiment. Right? That when you mess with other people's symbols instead of trying to make your own, you've already lost, basically. So this is a personal quest against spite, really. Spite is not productive strategy in life in general, and certainly not in poesy. So I've seen, as a Russianist, I've seen this done in a number of times. You just wonder, why do they have to wear clothes like that? Why would people, this is particularly the males, why would people buy a suit that is 2 numbers too big for them? You know, why would they go around looking like engineers when they know they're in a business where it's important to be visually dapper? This is not a question of vanity. You know, I use my privilege as a professor to walk around like this, right? I can do it because I'm in a business where it's not only okay to walk around like this, it's expected. Some absent minded I haven't noticed. I have noticed, you know, it's there. I need a new jacket. But you know, in diplomats and a number of other people are supposed to use the resources at their fingertips. And when they don't do it, there has to be a reason.
Have you asked the Russians?
Oh yeah. We don't care, we are men. So I think it's quite interesting. There's something unmanly about
Yes,
dressing up.
Manly about
You
wearing.
find it in the US as well. You know, so you've seen these American suits that look basically like sacks. You know, a friend wanted to buy a suit in Texas, and all the suits were like this. And he said, well, do you have anything that is a bit closer to the body? And he looked at it. You mean American, European style? No, we don't do that here. The male is not supposed to show off the body. That's for females. So something like that is the basic idea.
I think it would be useful to highlight that, to contrast the focus on women's sartorial choices. Because even if you pick up a magazine about, or a newspaper, often what is discussed about women in the public eye is what they're wearing and how they're wearing it. And you won't find those kind of comments about men in an equivalent position. So it's perhaps a product of the media, but also that I think that Russian sentiment would be a powerful way to contrast that discussion of Caroline Kennedy and Neumann as well. The way that's a very gendered difference.
That's obviously true. It's also true that this is changing. With Obama, there was a change. My wife is researching this, and you know, it was not just the First Lady who was commenting on it, it was also Obama himself. And there was a rather large newspaper coverage of how well dressed Obama was compared to W. He, for example, the material of his suits was, as a male, as a heterosexual male, I don't notice these things. I notice that he's well dressed, but I don't notice
the details.
The reason why, right? But the wife, of course. But the reason he looks so much better is that the suit is made of this very thin material, right? Whereas W walks around in sort of, well, it looks like body armor, right? Sorry, I'm going on a bit.
Can I just quickly insert a little ad that Iver's wife, Cecily Bosbeck-Neumann, will be giving a seminar next Wednesday at 12 o'clock at the UK Art Museum, precisely on the politics of fashion and gender dimension. So if you're interested, before I forget, that's of interest.
But do you think I should highlight it this more? Because I thought it was there, but you think I should say this?
Make it a little bit more explicit. Yeah. And there's also a footnote about first wives. And I think it might be interesting to highlight the rise of, I guess, the first gentleman, especially with the Luxembourg PM's partner being photographed with first wives, and people focusing on Melania Trump wearing quite a stylish dress, but then omitting that there was a man standing there amongst all of these women. Some media sources didn't deal with that, didn't want to acknowledge that there was a homosexual couple in this kind of game in this arena. And I think another example was Iceland's Prime Minister as well. So that might be an example that could help, because there was like a brief statement and I thought a little bit more of an explanation would help strengthen that as well.
As a Scandinavian, this is just so obvious to me. But at this point, I was a colleague with the first man of Norway for 15 years. I mean, his wife was the prime minister, and the stories he told were all about, you know, when you come on a state visit or when you come on a standard diplomatic visit, there's always a partners program. And it was all, I mean, he was sick and tired of it because, you know, there was, I can assure you, there were no sort of visits to breweries and things. It was all about sort of flower arrangements, and the making of glass was a big one. And he said, you know, I have to go on this because if I'm not there, the press will notice and there will be stories. And I'm bored stiff, right? So if there's something that is really gendered, high politics is definitely male gendered, but you know, these partners programs, if I were a feminist and I wanted to do something on diplomacy, I would have done an article on the partners programs, because they are, I mean, you really get to see what people expect that women are interested in, right? And it's not a pretty sight. And in Scandinavia, that has now changed so that there will be a couple of things that are not along those things, but the basic thing would still be flower arrangements and glass blowing. So, and that hasn't been documented to my knowledge. You know, so much work remains to be done.
Iver, just on the point of this, the presentations of bodies and people's fear of being too fashionable in certain instances, I wonder if Michael Kimmel's idea of masculinity as homophobia might be useful here, and some of the discussions around men's fear of making themselves desirable in the company of men. Just a thought.
This is Michael Kimmel of Unreasonable Men, right?
Yeah.
Yes, that's also an obvious one. I'm trying to affect a British accent to my English. Yeah. And in the US, I mean, and in a couple of settings, I've sort of experienced that people simply assume that I'm gay because I have this British accent. You know, WTF? You know, is that the case? Yeah. Very interesting. Okay. So the internal other, basically, of masculinity.
Yeah.
So I mean, it was very keen to come in. We've got plenty of opportunities for us as well. So.
I have a quick question, and then I'd like to follow up on your answer. Case study selection. Can I ask you why you went with these particular cases?
Yes, I try to give the basic reason in the paper that in terms of outcomes, the obvious choice would be to take treaty signatures, because that's the highly stylized thing. And you have the parties, and you have the pictures, and you have the pens, and you have a lot of things. But having worked on diplomacy for 15 years, and being also an anthropologist, you know, I'm more interested in social form than in outcome. You know, I'm interested in how the social is constituted. To me, the wonder of the world is not that somebody wins and somebody loses. That's a no-brainer. The wonder of the world is that there is such a thing as order at all. I'm just stunned every time I come home to my house and the garbage is taken away. I think, wow, it happened again. An act of what Bourdieu would call social magic. Right? In that sense, as a social form, the basic thing about diplomacy is reciprocity. Where do you find this reciprocity and this renewal of the contract that two states make to another in full flow? That is in accreditation. You know, this practice has a long history. But if you have to ask the question, it means that I have to sort of say it more clearly in the paper, I suppose.
I mean, it's kind of a loaded question because I guess the critique that I'd have of the framing of the paper, and I must admit I haven't spent as much time on it as I should have, but I wonder if a more ecumenical conception of diplomacy would help to kind of flesh out some of the payoffs that you're looking for. And I wonder if, you know, in the kind of age of complex multilateralism, whether engaging with a wider range of diplomatic fora and the visual regimes that kind of work in and around them, whether that would actually, you know, draw out some important aspects of visual politics. And two examples I have in my mind. One is the rather controversial figure of Yanis Varoufakis wearing a leather jacket. You know, I think he was on his motorcycle or something like that, meeting with EU bureaucrats to negotiate stuff around the Greek financial crisis. And the other is the representation of indigenous politics in comprehensive international negotiations on climate change. So thinking about the COP meetings under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the ways in which, among others, Pacific Island states do certain things with their bodies, their style, their ways of moving, their ways of being in those fora, which, you know, radically disrupt the kind of the you know, conventional understanding of state diplomacy that we've come to accept. And I think, you know, thinking, I guess, more broadly in terms of the continuities and discontinuities in the synchronic politics of complex multilateralism, but also the diachronic aspects of how they changed over time and what has led to change in visual registers in diplomacy that might open up some interesting avenues to take this stuff further.
What you're saying is absolutely true, but there are other people who do that much better than I do. Costas Constantinou with Rewind, the other one is sitting here. Who is Sally Butler, by the way? Is she here?
She's not here. She's an art history colleague of mine, works in art history, focusing on indigenous art.
Right. I know she's not in the room. I meant, is she here in Brisbane?
She's in Brisbane, yeah. She's in the next building over there. I'll see that we can meet up with her.
That would be nice, because I don't know whether you had a look at that article, but you know, it's about the indigenous presentation of it started with camping wagon, if I recall, didn't it? Or 74, 75?
Yes, there's sort of the tent embassy in front of the parliament. That's not the but we looked at a couple of exhibitions that actually preceded that.
And you know, all your examples are outliers, and they're interesting because they are different, right? You saw what happened. You saw what came off that diplomacy that the Greek financial minister tried to pull off. It was not exactly successful, was it? It was an abject failure. So, you know, he flaunted the rules and he paid for it. Well, he didn't pay for it, his country paid for it. Well, so far they haven't paid for it, but they will pay for it. So these would be much easier cases. I picked this case because no one can say that this is an outlier. This is as standard and as trad as it gets, right? So I want, you know, from here I'm traveling down to the ANU. They have a diplomacy program that is a diplomacy program. You know, these are the people basically read diplomacy articles. They are the ones I want to kick in the spine and say, listen, this is your home turf. These people, you can't say that these people are outliers. This is the standard stuff, right? So it's a critical case in method speak. So it's not that I'm against what you're saying. I sympathize, and in some sense it would even have been easier. Costas Constantinou is always sending me emails saying, "You traditional bastard, why don't you look at all these things?" And I say, well, I leave that to you. You know, there are different ways of undermining a field. You're doing it by saying, look at all the sort of what's going on in the margins. I try to do it at the center. And that's basically because I spent 5 years in that. I spent 5 years working in different sort of planning capacities in the Norwegian Institute, in the Norwegian Foreign Ministry. And there is these people who think they're so straight and think they're doing this traditional stuff. I mean, if you mentioned Kimmel, I mean, he does the same thing. He goes to the core of the basic sort of social presentation of masculinity as being rationality and says, bugger this, I mean, this is just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. And that's what I want to do. Right? But maybe I should say that.
Definitely. Yeah, fascinating. A couple things come up listening to people talk. The Obamas I think are interesting because as a micro point, the politics of respectability in African Americans is something that's really important. So like the elephant in the room in your piece I think is race, and which is I think an interesting way to frame it. Like the reason there are so many things about Michelle Obama and how she dressed and the comparison of the Obamas to animals and all that, which I think is an interesting piece. So in the politics of respectability more broadly would say it doesn't matter what you wear if you're black, right? Because you are always going to be looked at in a particular way. So a lot of my colleagues like just wear hoodies all the time because they know that the rest of it doesn't matter. Like ill-fitting suit, good-fitting suit, people see through you, right? Or they just automatically place you as like, oh, well, you're one of the good ones and these are the bad ones. So there's something deeper, I think, with race going on there. And maybe a way to get at that is, as you were talking, I was thinking in Latour's little skinny book on the modern cult of the factish gods. It's 3 essays, and one of them he has this really fascinating, I think it's a story about the Koreans who come early on in a diplomatic visit to Europe and are like, wow, this is really weird stuff. And they kind of explain what they see as they come. And it's that weird feeling of like how you're flipped and suddenly seeing through the eyes of the other, which is super helpful. So maybe for you, something that might help, you know, I mean, one, I think the body of the diplomat that you wrote was one of the like 3 articles on the body in IR at the time. So if you think about how much IR has shifted to think about this, it's great, right? And the fact that people think you're doing something new might even actually be a compliment. But maybe looking at Latour's
really?
stuff. No, really, like, you were one of 3 articles that I could use when I started my book, right? Now there's
yeah, but this is another lesson for everybody. You know, when we finally have a full book on the body in IR, which is Lauren Wilcox's book, she starts the book by saying, you know, there are a couple of articles on the body in IR, but they're very traditional. Parenthesis, Neumann 2000. So, you know, you have a window there if you want to do something new. And the first people say, well, no, this is not interesting because it's new, right? And then it said, well, this is obvious. And they say, oh, this is old.
People don't really like new things. Believe me, I'm a rogue scholar in my field. Nobody likes what I do, even though they say they want to. So looking at that you might be able to place kind of the West and the rest in this idea of objects and visuals and images as in a broader sense of how we became modern, right? So there would be kind of the themes of that book are about the dichotomies of the modern versus non-modern and the West versus the rest, and that poses an obstacle to how we compose a common world, right? So there's the micro and macro story there.
Thanks.
I have to apologise for being quite junior. They don't trust me with words like ecumenical right now, so my critique's going to be more broad and general. Thinking about the paper and the fact that it's rejected, I lack the grounding in both the diplomatic and the visual politics kind of literatures, but it felt like this piece kind of stood on its own as a work kind of detached from the literature, and I'm not wondering if that's what reviewers were tapping into. With that in mind, perhaps 2 aspects need to be explored or explored further. One would be historical continuity of your typologies, the sort of hegemonic, counter-hegemonic, and national modes of visual diplomacy. In mind here is Japanese diplomacy under the tributary system. I know for a fact they were engaged, or for a fact, politics is far from that sort of land, but it appeared that they were engaging in counter-hegemonic practices, and I'm fairly certain I've read at some point they were also engaging visually, like in emulation, but not so close of an emulation as to show deference. It was more about showing defiance. Secondly, visual diplomacy as strategic messaging. Often you see, you talk about Western diplomats being at home in suits, whereas the national dress tends to be reserved more for non-Western nations. But often at, for example, APEC or any large gathering of non-Western countries where there are Western attendees, there is the big photo opportunity where everyone's in the national dress. Perhaps that could be tied into the existing literature on diplomatic messaging and the sort of, as a semi-counter hegemonic strategy, but an attempt to put the Western nations, or indeed any non-regional nation, in the position of sort of the other that is normally assigned to them. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's kind of the impressions I got from purview of your paper.
Thanks, that is helpful. The basic stuff is also the most important stuff, right? David Kang has this book where he sort of uses this sort of 1598 war when Japan goes to war because they want to pay more tribute, which I think is rather cool. Well, you could also say they want more trading aspects. It means the same thing, but in the lingo of the tribute system, that would be the way you put it. That would make for very nice historical background.
I'm not sure if it's applicable.
No, but if you can remember where you saw that, because I'm not big on I don't know all that much about Japan.
It's a book in the library, I'll track it down.
That, if you could send me that reference, I would really like to have a look at it. Let me ask you all a question back. I found it fascinating because it dawned on me as I was doing this that what looked to me at first blush as a very Japanese spiel, the carriage and all the rest of it, that was simply a loan thing from the West. Does that come across well enough in the paper? Because I don't know about you, but as a Westerner who doesn't know all that much about Japan, I look at that picture of Caroline Kennedy coming, and it looks as if she's coming to a very different cultural setting. Then you start going through the thing, and it turns out that until after Perry came with his black ships, there was no such thing as a horse-drawn carriage in Japan at all. So this is a Western loan, which I think is just super cool, right?
Perhaps contrasting with an image or an artwork from the late Edo period, or not even the late Edo, the early Meiji period. Anyone who's an expert in Japan here? Might be useful to kind of show, well, this was how it was done until you did mention the humiliation, that was very clear, but the visual contrast might make the point better. The picture says 1,000 words, whether or not the word limit agrees is
But ultimately, all cultures, there's nothing seen as a pure culture, because even hundreds of years ago there have been international interactions, learning, adopted practices. So I think the idea of pure culture is sort of an essentialist notion that we don't have. The West too has adopted stuff from India, from Ring.
Totally, but what I'm after here is the naturalization of the thing.
Yeah.
That what I see is a Japanese thing, and it turns out it's a Western thing, which is always interesting. And contrasting it with something pre-1850s would that's not a bad idea actually, which is British for it's a great idea. The other thing, the suit's national dress. This is the second time. The first time was when was it?
Samit.
Yeah, Samit. When you made the point about the spectacular. Have you come across the APEC summits? They have this
That's
this
precisely the
ritualized
image that
thing,
I had in mind.
and it's exactly. It seems that I have to include that because you are the third audience that sort of imply that I should have said something about this. And it would be easy because I looked into it a little bit, and if anyone has a reference, I would like to see some scholarly work on it because I haven't been able to track that down. But the thing is, I think it's the last day, they have a photo op and everybody's wearing the national shirt, right?
Yes.
And one time that has not been done, that was when the US hosted, right? And the other says, where are the shirts? Hey, where's the shirt, dude? And they wear no shirts, right? So, and I don't think that's because the Americans don't like shirts. I simply think it is because what would the American thing be? That's the problem of being hegemonic. Your shirt is not cool. Your shirt is just the shirt, right? White is not a color. White is just what you should look like, right?
Hawaiian shirts are probably a bit too informal for the setting.
Right? The shirt is the suit in this case, right?
Yeah.
And so that sort of taps into the
that's
the sterilisation of visual diplomacy.
The indigenous
the
issue,
modern age.
that would be an issue. But anyway, we got two questions, Maybe we can take them together.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. Thank you very much. The first thing that struck me when I read the article was how applicable this would be to defense diplomacy. Because if the visual was constitutive of diplomacy, this would be even more true of defense diplomacy. It's about the bigger ships, the bigger gun, or in the mode of making friends, building up military to military ties. But in that, there is always an element of competition, right? When you wear the uniforms, is a common military culture, but you want to see who has the most ribbons on your left breast of your uniform, and I feel that it would really benefit from having such a study on some aspects of defense diplomacy, which has been very understudied as well. Thank you.
Well, the US is launching their multi-billion hangar ship thing any second now, so maybe there could be some photos of that. But yes, or the 322 thing in the Pacific in the early 1900s might also. Yeah. Do you have any particular pictures in mind? Because this would be a sort of mine is bigger than yours picture, right?
Right. Any military meeting or when they present medals, or even when they are engaging in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief efforts.
The training that's happening, now, this huge big ship here in docking out in Brisbane, you can go and have a look at it in the pier. It's huge. It's a aircraft carrier, and there is an oar and pomp around it, and I don't know, 5,000 soldiers or are coming down, and it's over the news for the last 3 days. So it's about that. I guess my contribution to your paper, and thank you for the opportunity, is probably a couple of things. The first one is about symbolism. For me, the visual is about symbolism, and diplomacy again is about symbolism and the nuancing. So I think if that becomes a framework, then we can understand the carriage, the symbolism of the carriage. Is it because it links to the Western idea of imperialism? The cultural dress. When I read that, when I looked, being a person of a non-Western culture, when I looked at the Mongolian, I zoomed into the cultural dress, and I felt comfortable with that because it is a post-colonial thing. I saw it within the context of colonialism. So this is, a person reflecting sovereignty through their culture. So maybe we need to also look at things through the symbolism of things that are not necessarily Western or Western. I'm still thinking about it, but I think there is something there within diplomacy to look at that. It's so most of what you talked about is fashion, you know, and the gendering of fashion and so on. But what about other aspects of it? Because again, diplomacy is, you know, who goes first, who comes next. That level of nuancing, and you can spike people by stepping back or stepping forward or seating them not at the head but on the side and stuff like that. So to me, that's also about visual diplomacy and checking it out. And maybe you spoke a little bit about that with the Israeli and German accreditation, where, you know, someone was stepping forward and the other was being aloof and standing back in that spiteful way of it. So that's one part. The second one was my reading of the paper. I couldn't connect with the first part of the paper. I just didn't see a thread through it. Maybe because I was tired, it was late at night or something like that. But I thought there were a lot of ideas and themes within it, and I'm happy to be told otherwise. Yeah.
That wouldn't help, would it? If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. The hook has to be, I mean, in terms of technicalities of writing a paper, the hook has to be good and the conclusion has to be good, and the rest people will forget, right? The title is extremely important, because if you read it and you want to refer to it, it has to have a snappy title, right? So we should always use an ad bureau for our titles, right? No, seriously, if the first part of the paper is too heavy, something has to be done, because that's just not good enough. On the Mongol deal and the sovereignty, well,
it's probably the symbolism of culture and what that means. Through the
just
cultural dress.
If you go and have a look at the sort of Chinese way of running their empire through the centuries, one of the key points was that the emperor had a harem consisting of women from all over the known world. And it was a key point not only what was underneath the clothes, but also that the clothes should be from the specific places.
Yeah.
So that the imperial project was to gather the differences and have them there. So in one context, the national costume may be a post-colonial thing, but it's also a super imperial thing to sort of, so it's a way of exoticizing people to say, gee, look at how they dress, kind of thing, right?
But that's when, look, I understand what you're saying, but then when the diplomat themselves wears it, what's the symbolism of that? Rather than the harem being dressed from the different areas to show again the symbolism of I am great. When I wear it, what does that mean?
I would have thought it's a pride.
Absolutely.
And it's a symbolic pride.
Yep.
And
so with the meeting of equals.
Yes.
And to me that is a reflection of a post-colonial. In the past I was a lesser, now I am an equal.
Yeah.
And my culture makes me that.
But what I tried to do there was to demonstrate that the Mongol state now thinks of itself, and I think has a good claim to being a successor state to something that once ruled the world. I mean, I have a book in press with a Turkologist colleague on the Eurasian steppe, and the Mongol situation from the early 1200s and until the late 1300s is of course a world-spanning. Well, if we leave out Southeast Asia and Japan, and of course we can't leave out Southeast Asia. We can't do that, can we? But you know, if we can for this textual moment. They think of themselves still as a world power, right? So they assume that everyone will understand the sort of rich color symbolism of the deal. Now, how many around the table can tell me what the knife of the deal actually symbolizes and what the blue symbolizes? I would guess no one. right? So it doesn't fly. So they may feel that this is super important and talks to everybody, but it doesn't. And that must be quite galling. Yeah? And it's that one I'm trying to drive at. You know, that this goddamn Caroline Kennedy can come with her little clutch or her shoulder bag and her necklace, and everyone said, oh gee, we know what that counts. But that's the demony for me, right? So coming in the national costume, it makes it makes a standpoint that here is this national costume, but nobody understands what it means, right?
I think in that part of the world as well, there is a resurgence in cultural identity. Yeah, I think what you were trying to say is because the Russians were very much in charge of Mongolia, and then the Chinese are now also having a big impact on them. And then working with Tibetan minorities, and then hearing about what's happening with other minorities in China, that the Cultural Revolution still isn't really over for them. And so sometimes the only power that they have is to demonstrate their cultural identity as a kind of resilience. So that, yeah, we're still alive and kicking, and you can't take this away from us. So that kind of pride in culture is sometimes a kind of solidarity among people from those states, like with Tibetans and Uyghurs and Mongolians, and that might be...
Absolutely. It's also the case that Mongolia has one of the world's largest and most well-organized Nazi movements. Which I find absolutely fantastic, because the Nazis went big on Mongols. The whole Nazi thing, the package as such, is a very specific cultural package coming out of a very specific German historical moment. And then it's transplanted, complete with not a swastika, but with some kind of sort of, I mean, they have changed it a bit, so it looks like a swastika, but it isn't. And the black shirts, the armbands, you know, the whole caboodle, basically. Well, that's neither here nor there. At least it's visual, right?
Well, we got quite a few more additional.
Should we take them?
Comments? We'll take them.
Are we?
We're fine. We're fine. Yep. Like we've got. I think Shreya has been waiting for a long time to come in. So.
I really enjoyed your paper. I especially liked how you located in the three different types: Western, national, and anti-national. And you still said that the national still sort of, and the anti-national at the end of it in your conclusion, you said it still in some ways complies with the Western hegemony. So I would actually like it to see an example of otherwise as well. So in national, what was interesting to me was that what falls in the ambit of the national was when the Duchess of Cambridge, when she had visited India, I think last year or sometime earlier, she wore Western dresses, but it was by Indian designers. So I'm not sure how I look at it. Do I look at it as something that is patronizing, as cultural appreciation? So where would I locate that? But yes, it does fall very well into your ambit of national. But at the same time, we have a lot of ministers, and the ex-Afghani president, he made a point of no matter where he went, and I've met him personally as well, no matter where he went, he had this entire visual paraphernalia. He wouldn't be photographed without it. He had his hat, I'm calling it a hat, but he had his Pashtun hat, he had his entire shawl, he always wore his traditional dress. So how does that fall in the national ambit, or does it fall in the anti-national ambit? So there are cases, because visuals are very dynamic, so there are cases that don't fall into any boxes. So just maybe mentioning them, or just adding that there are otherwise many examples. I'm just quoting one of them. So how would that be placed then?
Well, that again would be hybridization, like the horse carriage, wouldn't it? One of my favorite, I tried to find a way of putting this sort of story into the paper when the Mahatma was visiting London. and was wearing nothing but I don't even
Yeah,
know the name.
he refused to comply.
And I can't remember the name. And it was a rainy day. It must have been cold as hell. Sorry, I'm a Norwegian, so I always think. I mean, clothes really only do three things, right? They keep you comfortable, they differentiate your status, and they differentiate gender. That's the three things that clothes do, right? And as a Norwegian, when it's cold and I see people who wear very little, you know, I want to go out and say, I mean, do you need a jacket? Style has to be put to one side.
Secondary.
Comfort is important when you're used to sort of 10 degrees below on a regular basis, right? So he's wearing this, and I don't know the name. Is that that's not the dhoti. The dhoti would be the trousers.
Yeah,
right?
it's just a shawl or just a wrap, actually.
And he was asked by this is the 30s, right? So he was asked by a British journalist, you know, are you going to see the Queen sort of underdressed like this?
That, yeah.
And he says, I think the Queen will be wearing enough for both of us. It's a wonderful line, right? I mean, it's just, but that's not how it works now, is it? Because you can't really come in something like that. It doesn't have any news value anymore, right? When people are wearing saffron in an official Indian business, it's a nationalist statement, not against the West. Yeah. It's a national statement against the local Muslims, isn't it?
Yeah.
So the hybridization thing changes the whole game. Maybe I should say this. Maybe I should say something about visual, scopic regimes and visual modes being changed forever by globalization and hybridization. It's easy to say because it's true. That's one of the nice things about saying something that's true. We should do it more often. We should try. Someone should tell Trump this.
Thank you so much for your paper, Professor. I also benefited from the inputs, empirically speaking, the empirics that you suggested. But I want to ask a theoretical question. Pardon my naivety, but when I was reading the paper, I was lost in finding the theoretical argument or framework of the paper. I saw the argument. I read the argument as why visual diplomacy matters, and you were trying to address that. But I didn't see any theoretical argument at all. But I like the idea of the relationship between the self and the other. And if I may, if you can tighten up the theoretical argument, it could be on that angle, the relationship between the self and the other. And if you can juxtapose that with the West and the rest, a way to tighten it is actually to look at, for example, the practice term, the relational term, the different terms that you also mentioned in the paper. But I'm particularly interested in the concept, which I am also struggling in my readings, the concept of co-constitutiveness or constitutivity. How do the self and the other co-constitute each other? And there were questions about cultural identity, national identity a while ago. So that would fit into that question on how do we establish the relationship between the self and the other, or the West and the rest? What kind of what happens to subjectivity of each of these categories, or if you may, the intersubjectivity, if there is, and what kind of intersubjectivity? For example, you do away, if I may, or debunk Habermas in one part of the paper. Habermas has this concept of intersubjectivity even in the ideal situation that he was talking about. But in your paper, if you debunk him or disregard his claim altogether, then what would be the concept of intersubjectivity that would define the relationship between the self and the other? The second question, very quickly, is what is the relationship between visuality and normativity? I think we might be gesturing towards a certain norm or practice of visual diplomacy. Again, anchored on the relationship between the self and the other, or the West and the rest. Thank you.
This is obviously a self-other paper, where the basic problem is that the practices followed by the self will remain such that they talk to home audiences, as this becomes more and more true, and you just gave an example. If a nationalist Indian leader does not wear saffron at an official meeting, he is bound to be critiqued by the right wing of the BJP, right?
Yeah.
That's not specific for India. You have examples in a number of other places. Steve Bannon is to me just a wonderful example. You noticed how he dresses? He makes a point of looking like a nerd, right? Because he wants to signal that I am an ordinary person, right? Just like everybody else living in a trailer park, I earned billions of dollars from making Seinfeld and other TV shows, right? And I still dress like a regular guy, right? No, I'm sure that I drink coarse beer when I'm doing taken on camera. I mean, that's that whole thing. And that becomes more important the more educated people you have, the more education people have, because they will consume more and more pictures in more and more sophisticated ways. So this is just going to increase, right? So you have to signal to the self. You also have to signal to the other. And to me, that's a basic problem. Right? And point of theory is always to try and, for me, is always to try and move the received opinion in something. And the received opinion is always specifically located. There is no such thing as a global received opinion or an Australian received opinion. It's always specific to discourses. And in the discourse on diplomacy, the received opinion is that this is not a problem. This state does that state does this. Right? Well, I'm trying to show that this is not the case, that you cannot signal in this way. It is not possible to come in a deal and just think that everybody will understand what you're trying to signal. Right? That there is, since you're of a theoretical bent of mind today, there is an incommensurability about this. You know, the two cannot meet. That's also what I mean in my critique of Habermas, that you cannot sit down and have a dialogue and solve this. You know, the visual does not work like that. Right? You can't find a visual way of communicating that everybody can understand. And I will add, as a post-structuralist, thank God, because the whole point to me of the world is difference. And, you know, the signal that you send when you dress in these ways is, I mean, the reaction you want is a Justin Bieber reaction. What do you mean, right? I mean, why do you dress like that? Right? I mean, what is it that you're trying to say? Right? That's one thing. To me, the paper is a theoretical contribution to debate on hegemony, where I'm trying to look at hegemony in terms of practices and say these are certain practices that carry hegemony that we haven't looked at before. But you're absolutely right. What I'm trying to do here is not specifically a theoretical thing, although I think of it as theoretically informed. It's a methods paper. It's, if we're interested in historical, theoretical things like hegemony, practices, we shouldn't only look at textual data, we should also look at visual data. So, you know, I tend to be much more humble in my appropriations than the grand theory, the bigger meta theory. I try to do this in a more grounded way, right? By saying this is how it works in this specific empirical setting. So in one way, I'm rather pleased that you don't find the specific theoretical contribution, because I think of theory as scaffolding for an empirical analysis. We're not philosophers, we're social scientists. When the scaffolding has done its job, you can take it down again. But you couldn't have built the thing without the scaffolding. That was a rather snide answer, wasn't it?
Now, before I pass on to Mari for the next question, I just want to stress that Iver has written probably what is the defining book on self-other relations in diplomacy and foreign affairs. Probably one of the most influential books in IR over the past 15, 20 years ago. So yeah. Anyway, Mari for the next one.
Well, I have a few comments, some directly, some only tangentially relevant. First of all, in photo picture 4, when you said it was Photoshop, it took me a minute to realise that the coachman, whatever it is, isn't beheaded. I had a moment where I thought he didn't have a head. And then I had to think, no, that's the...
Hang on, I must say this.
Because, yeah.
We're talking about this one, right?
Yeah, it just looks like his hat, like...
Oh, yeah.
And then I had to go back to the previous picture. No, it's just the angle. Yeah, but anyway, I just thought that was... Geez, they Photoshop his head.
I had that reaction too, and then, what?
So, yeah, that was just random. And, again on the...
You mean it looks like the top of his hat is his collar, right?
Yeah. But in terms of hegemony, if I remember this correctly from my protocol training, that the most important person sits to the right of the spectator, unless you are then in societies where you read from right to left. And then if you're the hosting society and your visitor is from a culture where they, and then deciding what takes precedence. I kept thinking of that, not that it's relevant to any particular one of these, but always kind of looking at who's left and who's right and who should be left and right. It's just something that came to mind randomly. The other thing I wanted to comment on was the whole, and this is probably not the right forum for it necessarily, and we've spoken about this in various ways, but Caroline Kennedy and sexuality, femininity, just as a, starting out as a 22-year-old single woman in foreign affairs, and just often this is the discrepancy between the outward shows of respect, everyone standing up and sitting down. Every time I went to the bathroom, I felt like I was in Downton Abbey. But then at the same token being told by a minister that I should, marry a Muslim man because they're better lovers than non-Muslims or whatever. Just that vast discrepancy between the outwards display of respect and also South African. I think South Africa makes an incredibly interesting case study in terms of
which one?
South Africa. In terms of that relationship with the South, because the South African diplomatic service was obviously so incredibly white and so incredibly Western until 20 years ago. And that transition of basically flushing out most of the career diplomats in South Africa, but still very much operating in that Western paradigm. And also you have the visual of that change, and even in terms of the kinds of photos that they put up of the, senior politicians. And I found that just fascinating, in that internal conversations around what is a representation of the South, what is the South African South, and how should that be, how do you appropriately represent that, is just, and then just on a personal note, I think my own personal anecdote of visual diplomacy, one sitting outside a meeting of the Palestinian and Israeli ambassadors, and for what it's worth, South Africa recognises Palestine as a state, so we have a Palestinian embassy and ambassador and everything. And one of the officials from the Palestinian embassy and the bodyguard to the Israeli ambassador having a conversation about whether or not I would be stopped at a Palestinian border post, because my hair is naturally curly, and they were having this conversation about would they think I'm Palestinian, or would they think I'm Israeli, based on my visual, what I look like. And never got to test it because I never actually got to go. But I always think that it's just fascinating little.
I have this thing all the time. Because I'm a Norwegian. You probably wouldn't guess it, but I was blonde as a child. And my wife is 1/8 gypsy, and we had a blonde child together, right? I mean, her hair is raven black, right? And when I'm in Europe, wherever I go in Europe, I'm being told that I could be from there. And then my last name is Neumann. And Neumann is a name that could be a standard German name, or it could be the name of a Jewish convert to Christianity, because you're a Neuanthropos, you're born again, so you're a new man. Neumann, right? Neumann in German. And my oldest daughter is named Ida.
So when I'm in Russia, people simply assume that I'm Jewish. And there have been a number of very interesting sort of things flowing from that. People inviting me to their homes, and then it turns out I'm not Jewish, and they invited me because they thought I was Jewish, and the whole thing is just. So this is when it helps being an anthropologist, because instead of being super embarrassed, you say, "Oh, gee, how interesting!" Right? But yeah, I know what you're talking about. But so this has happened to me a number of times. But I've always wondered, we always complain about, why do people do this, and sort of, shouldn't they do this and they do that? But what else could we do? What else could we do? If we don't have categories, we can't understand the social. We have to start somewhere. So I'm just trying to say, starting somewhere. Where does this fit in, though? Why did you come to think of this when you read my paper? That's interesting, because this is not the vista I wanted to steer people down. Right?
Well, I suppose I'm one of those people that the public and the private and the official and the personal to me isn't that to some extent what visual diplomacy is an exercise in the marrying of that which can be intensely personal and that is why it can evoke such emotion and such reaction. Yet there is this almost veneer of officialdom that has to kind of keep it all in check. Right? Thank you.
Diplomats use this. I mean, they use it to make a rapport, and they will say things in intellectual circles. You will now say, "So you're Jewish? How very interesting." I mean, you just don't do that. Diplomats do it all the time, simply because you have to start the conversation somewhere. But I didn't think of that being interesting data for this paper. Why? Sorry for repeating a question here, but I need to do this because if I've pulled a button, if I've pushed a button in the paper that I didn't mean to push, it's important to know how that happens so that I can either push it because I want to push it or not push it altogether.
Yeah. Think about that more. I don't know.
The other thing that comes to me is that I have a paper on the diplomatic meal. Where this thing about whether you sit to the left or sit to the right, so that's super important. So one way of doing this paper would be to sort of bring out the abstract made a point of that the hegemony thing by reading the case study of accreditation up against the diplomatic meal. That would also answer your concerns a bit, I think. But I thought I would sort of not do it because I wanted to have at least a little bits of space to unfold this case study. Maybe that would be a possibility.
What are we having here? Want to come in for a while?
Well, two things. One, I mean, in terms of like organization and film and literary studies, we always just start with the sexy anecdote and then backfill. And so I actually, you liking, I think the Mongolian one, that's the fun, sexy, accessible hook.
The Mongolian.
Yeah, and then you start with a picture too. And I think then you would backfill all the other stuff because then it's kind of like that picture does a lot of work, I think. And then following on that, I'm looking at the New York Post, which I'll have something to say about in a second. And so it's Photoshop, but you also said the same series of pictures. And I think, thinking about sound for a second, when you watch coverage of when these events happen, you just hear because they still make shutter sounds on digital cameras. So it's hundreds and hundreds of pictures. And you can go to like Getty, or you can go to like the White House website, and you have lots of pictures to choose from. And I feel like and then I look at the New York Post. It's a tabloid and has a particular audience that it's interested in. Versus it's not the New York Times, or it's not like the Washington Post, which is like the industry paper for Washington D.C. And so I feel like it's just one picture, and as someone who has a droopy eye, lots of pictures of me look like I've been drinking all day, and that's just because I'm tired. I don't drink at all. And so I think like actually here, someone like the photo editor matters. Because you've got 100 pictures to choose from. How many pictures do you look of President Obama or a senator, and they find the gold circle of a light fixture, so they get this halo around them. But there are a bunch of other ones where like Mitch McConnell has like 68 chins. And so I think like this becomes the question of what audiences are being addressed. And I think a comparative thing would be, well, what does this look like? What did the Ulaanbaatar paper use versus what did the Telegraph use? What did the Standard choose? Because then you can see that the same thing, and as someone coming from film studies, are we getting low angle shots? Are we getting high angle shots? What's getting cropped? All those things I think would be a really interesting kind of comparative approach to kind of make that multiple audiences live.
This is exactly why I included the New York Post picture, but obviously I haven't done a good enough job of spelling that out. But in the major picture I've taken from Getty, everything is geared towards showing her in the most elegant light possible. Right? She's light of foot, she's very, very composed. I mean, the body control is, she looks like a champion tennis player in the way she comports herself, right? Whereas in the New York Post book, she looks, I don't know if frumpy is the word, but she looks definitely, I think, homely, maybe the word I'm looking for. And the smile is more sort of, it's not that elegant at all. So and that's why I wanted it there. But I suppose I should have said that they're pandering to a specific tabloid audience, right? Is New York Post a Trump paper these days? Or?
No, The Observer is on. Is it The Observer that Kushner owns?
I think it's slightly.
I mean, the Post is a tabloid. They hate everybody.
Yeah. They hate everybody. But okay, so I should spell this. Is this the consensus in the room that I should spell this out? Because this is done in 5 minutes. The audience thing is very important to me, and I wanted to have that out of the paper.
Can I have a follow-up question that maybe addresses that, and I'll pass down to Connie in a minute, and Helen as well. Look, my sense is sort of the paper is really exploring the links between visuality, culture, and power in the context of diplomacy. And if we look at what you just mentioned, it might help in the introduction to the little book on visual global politics, where you've kindly done the paper on monuments. I'm trying to differentiate between different aspects of the visual. So we have on the one hand images, like you just said, like snapshots, whether it's a photograph or a film, they're snapshots of particular situations from a particular angle with a particular kind of aesthetic, chosen by editors of newspapers. They circulate, that's one aspect of the visual. But then we also have visual artifacts. We have the horse carriage that you mentioned, we have the dresses, they don't circulate the same way. They're in a time-space kind of confined, but they're visual too. And then we have the visual performances, where people move around, they behave in certain bodily ways, they interact, and they're all visual, but all these three things act differently, in terms of what they are, in terms of the extent to which they confine to locality, the extent to which they circulate globally. So I'm wondering how if that helps you in terms of audience, in terms of how the visual relates to precisely culture, power, interactions at the global scale.
Visual genres.
Yeah. Because they operate according to a different logic and different politics, and different cultures might actually operate differently in these fields.
Yes. This is very helpful. Thank you. I'll just take that to heart.
I'll just pass on to Connie and to Helen.
What I've been trying to do that, because there is this phrase in the paper, making the visual visible, which is important here, because in a mediated well, a lot of you come from communication, etc. You know, the face-to-face thing, the actual handing over of the accreditation papers is, I mean, the audience there is yay big and not particularly consequential because they know and they're the insiders anyway. I mean, the key thing is getting it out to other audiences, right? So I have some stuff tucked away in footnotes on how foreign ministries do that. You know, who use it? Photographers who actually have sort of use what's the name of places like Getty's stock agencies, right? Who use theirs? Who use the diplomats themselves? There's a number of countries, not only the small ones. Brazil does this. They just give their diplomats cameras and say, take pictures and send it to them. And then what they usually do is they put it all up on Flickr and then they send an email to the newspapers and say, you know, it's on Flickr now, so you just take the pic. And this is important. The production side, well, you're from film studies, I mean, you know this shit, but in IR people don't, I mean, they don't think about this, right? And it's important. So, you know, but where do I put it in and how much space do I give it? Because this is really what people don't want to read about, right?
Look, with any paper, it's always a choice of what you put in, what you highlight, what you subordinate, and yes, it looks like we're adding more work.
No, that's all right, I have the info, so...
So Connie and Helen, maybe you can just pose a question and then Iver answers it.
Okay, well, I've just got a couple of question comments. I'm rolling through it, so I won't get in trouble now. Thank you, Eva. I really enjoyed reading this paper. I thought it was fantastic. I just want to jump in on what the film studies colleague has just said. Is that I found it interesting that, because I went and looked up what Caroline Kennedy, how she might have represented that particular example with her social media account. She tweeted the one where she looks like I did, like that picture, the New York Post one. She's kind of like got a double chin and whatever. So that was the image.
She said that?
Well, no, she didn't say that. I think that. But for me, I would have, yeah. That
hang on. What's the status of what you're saying? You looked at her blog or?
Her Twitter feed, because I was just interested to see whether she'd tweeted that because.
And she hadn't.
No, she had, and she'd chosen the image that we.
With the headless
surprised.
one.
Yeah, the one with the
Could
headless
you
one.
send me that reference?
Yes, I can. I'll find
Because
it.
you see, I'm not a digital native. You know,
Yeah.
I'm born in 1959. You know, the idea of going in and looking at someone's Twitter feed, I know what that means because my kids tell me.
Yeah, totally. Yeah,
So
no,
that would be very much appreciated if you can send me an email with
Yeah.
that info.
I think
Because
so
that
too,
would
yeah.
that would strengthen the point I'm making about the slightly eat, wine, smile, right?
Yes, and
Is
because-
that too snide, by the way? Is that
No.
all right, or?
Yeah, and I think it's because you also reference you reference the internet and the expanding number of audiences and all that kind of stuff. And with the Twitter aspect, there's a lot of comments under the image that she's chosen because she's like, well, hi Japan, welcome, or thanks for welcoming me, blah blah blah. And a lot of Japanese tweeters, I presume, are like, thanks, we're happy to have you. But there's like 1,500 retweets, and I think you mentioned there was about 500 hits on the net with the pictures. So it's kind of like maybe the social media aspect of it is something that you could consider as another performative kind of framework. Two small points. Anne Hathaway isn't a model, she's an actress. And I think that she didn't actually wear underwear. So I feel like in that kind of debate, which is really fascinating, I think it could go much further with that, is that kind of rolling thing we're seeing now where women are exposing body parts deliberately to get pictures or more pictures and then, get more film roles or whatever. It had a backlash for her. But to my mind, I don't feel diplomats are ever going to be in the situation where they're panties, they don't have their underwear on. That's what that image was about. Like, well, it's just, I found that really interesting because I'm like, wow, we need to talk about this stuff because it's so prolific now. And there's also an element of like, I'm not very good at this, but the political economy of fashion. So even though Caroline Kennedy is representing her history and her mother and all this kind of stuff, what label did she choose? And I'm sure people would have talked about that somewhere in the type of jewellery she was wearing. And because she's such an interesting individual, it goes to the issue of like, do we talk about Trump's tweets and can we extrapolate anything out of that, or is it just because he, as who he is, that's what the referent point is versus her? I think
But you see, you can do things as a woman and you can do things as a male.
Yes,
And
yeah.
I had stuff on Anne Hathaway's crotch in there.
Yeah, yeah.
And I made a historical point that in the days before the knickers, a woman taking a tumble was one of the great sort of everyday spectacles of Renaissance England. It's even a key point of vernacular, should we call it poetry? Well, see what I'm getting at. I made that point, and I had more stuff on her purse. You know, not the necklace, but the purse. And the reactions I got from some of the women in the audience represented that was, you can't do this. I don't take that to heart that much, because I can do what I want. But there is something about publishing, A, getting it published, and B, if there is too much that causes offense in the I don't mind causing offense, but I want to cause offense in the areas where I want to make a point. And I'm not interested in making a point about Anne Hathaway's crotch. So, you know, as a male, as if nobody, this speaks to what you're saying as well, nobody bats an eyelid if women go on about choices of purses, etc. If I do it, it's a statement, right? And I can't do that. Well, I can, but I won't, right? So there's something about the situatedness here.
Yes, and I think that's what I'm probably not doing very well, but trying to make it draw the distinction between someone who's an actress deliberately doing that and kind of the sliding out of the whatever that is, the horse-drawn carriage thing, and you know, just maybe allowing space for other things.
But this is news to me. I mean, she showed a bit of crotch in order to get more, should we say, exposure. Yeah. So. Right. Okay.
But there was
Wasn't there something about someone spilling her tits on TV a couple of years ago?
Probably, yes. And but there's a big kind of.
No. There was a big thing about.
Jackson, right?
That's the one. Yep. Right. Janet Jackson. So this has become a phenomenon. And you're saying, but if this is the case, maybe I should leave out the Anne Hathaway example altogether.
Well, that's what I was wondering and trying to say. Perhaps if you remove that, you have more space for other things that might go a little bit more towards kind of.
This is so interesting because you see, what I wanted to do was to validate the fact that here we have. I mean, the practice term has been sort of one of my key things, and here we have. I translated Marcel Moses' essay on the bodily techniques into Norwegian because I think we're looking way too little on the body in IR. Still, Stephanie, I was just being facetious when we talked about it. So, and here there is a question of validating something that is super hard to do. I borrowed a pair of high-heeled shoes from I'm an anthropologist, and anthropologists have to go through the bodily experience of doing things in order to understand them. That's our way, that's our method, that's how we produce the data. And I tried to negotiate the cobblestones outside my house on those high heels. Very interesting. I almost broke my ankle, right? And you know, my heart went out to her because negotiating those steps, I mean, have you seen those steps? They're about yay long, right? And she's wearing heels. How do you, the mind boggles, you know, how do you do that?
It's easy going upstairs.
I see women in Russia doing this on cobblestones all the time, and they wear heels. I mean, seriously, I've never seen a Russian woman take a tumble on cobblestones. How is that possible? I don't understand it. That's what we call the body technique, right? And I wanted to validate that female diplomats have to have these skills that male diplomats. They also need them, but you know, they don't need to negotiate stuff in heels, right? But the reactions I get are the complete opposite, you know. I mean, that this is sort of superfluous. Maybe males can only write about this in 20 years, you know. But I'm fascinated by this. I mean, I'm fascinated in an aesthetic way, I'm also fascinated in a scholarly way, how this is possible. So, but if it doesn't work, I'll have to take it out.
I mean, you could just go with it and do it, but I totally take your point that people might be offended. I think it's fascinating. I love this kind of stuff. But I just think maybe if it's not working, that maybe could give space to other things, that kind of thing. And and it's women are socialised into wearing heels as well. So it's not just women diplomats, but women in general.
Yeah, but it's interesting because it's a different repertoire and it's expected. So if you want to account for how diplomats use their bodies in the world, this stuff should be there.
It's also kind of a uniform for women. I think maybe a slightly more apt example would be, I think, the Cannes red carpet, where a female director showed up and she was wearing flats, and they sent her home and they said she had to get changed into heels.
Heels and power.
Yeah. And sometimes it's a symbol of power for women. But it's kind of a uniform that's expected. What would the reaction have been if she wasn't wearing all of that? She didn't have that accoutrement. Is that the kind of visuality that's expected of her?
I published a book with Cornell that I worked on for 17 years called At Home with the Diplomats, which is an ethnography of diplomacy. And one of the things I did for that was to interview the remaining early Norwegian diplomats, with female diplomats. The first one and the second one were dead. So I got number 3 and 4, 5 and 6. And number 3 and 4 had taken 2 entirely different paths on this. One of them was always wearing flats. She was always wearing, we got to be friends, so I met her on a regular basis for years afterwards. And always wearing a turtleneck or a mock turtle, always wearing flats, usually wearing trousers. The other one was a sort of super high heels kind of person. Necklaces, the whole spiel. And what I took from that and checked out in other sort of diplomatic circles is that there's a choice to be made here. You can play femininity up or down, right? And this seems to be changing now because young women tend to, at least in the Norwegian service, tend to play both horses. They change by context. So they're perfect neoliberal subjects because they simply, it's a chameleon to the surface they're on at any one given point. So there's a chapter on that in that book, but I don't want to go into it too much here because if I start gendering the paper, the referees will say either take it out or give us more, and which I think is a sign of how bad we're treating gender, because gender is a total social phenomenon. It's always there, which means that any article could at any one point dip into gender and then dip out again. But there will be headbangers saying, either you should do only gender or you shouldn't do gender at all, which I think is just totally mistaken. Yeah? As you can see, I'm struggling with how to, with positionality or situatedness here, how to position myself in relation to all this. And it doesn't help that the wife always says, more gender, right?
Now we hit almost lunchtime and Helen has been wanting to come in, so rather than having a long dialogue between Helen and Iver, I thought we'll just give Helen the last word before lunch. Is that agreeable?
Sure. My comment was just, I guess, thinking about audiences and your focus on different audiences in different places. And I noted, it goes to Christian's point as well, when you talk about the Kennedy example, the audience that you discuss is both the US or the broader West and some of the Japanese feedback to that event of Kennedy arriving, whereas the Mongolian ambassador example, it's only Western media that you're looking at, and going back to these earlier conversations about the purpose of dress and why he maybe dressed like that. It would be interesting to see what the Mongolian media said about that meeting, and in a speculative way, was he wearing those clothes not for the West but for, for Mongolians and some, thinking about different power and being a small country and, those kind of, the way that he represents himself on the global stage. And maybe just adding that into that section would strengthen it and tie those examples more fully together. That's the final bit.
Look, thanks everyone for your comments, feedback, input. We not only had a great discussion on Iver's paper, but I think a great discussion on the range of visual themes that pop up in probably some of your work and questions as well. That's sort of themes that keep recurring about audience, about method, about focus, about structure in the paper. And We'll have the afternoon sessions to dig in more deeply on that, and we'll probably before we start the afternoon, I'll say a few words about the format to make sure that everyone gets their paper presented. We'll have a bit of a time challenge, but I'm sure we'll manage it.